Hi, this is Jack for iPokerVIP.net. Today I'm going to make a short video talking about implied odds, hands that we can play for implied odds and hands that we sometimes shouldn't play for implied odds. First off, we'll start with a definition. So when we're talking about implied odds, we're talking about calling with a hand which relies on extracting value after hitting in order to be played profitably. So a good example of this is when the under the gun player opens and we've got a hand like pocket twos. We can call to try and hit a set. We know that we're probably not going to be able to win unless we actually manage to make a set. So we know that we have about a 7.5 to 1 chance of hitting, and therefore we must win over 8 times our investment on average in order to show a profit. So for example, if we're playing 51 and our opponent opens to $3, we can call there with our twos if we think that on average we're going to be able to win $24 off him post flop when we hit. This would lead to creating at least a $48 pot. Since obviously we'll be putting in 24 as well. So therefore, you know, we definitely need to be fairly deep stacked with our opponent. If he's raising pre-flop and he's only got like 30 big blinds, then we're probably not going to be able to call profitably, just because so often he's not going to have a hand that can stack off. That's what's going to happen most of the time when you flop a set, is you're going to raise the flop or you're going to raise the turn, or your opponent's just going to check fold the turn. You know, and there's going to be so many situations where you just win a small little pot that you really need to be quite deep in order to show a profit, because of the times when he happens to have like an overpair and stacks off to you. With suited connector hands, our probability of flopping a flush or a straight is less than 2%. So we're flopping a good made hand very, very rarely with a flush, with like suited connectors like 4-5 suited, 7-8 suited. Flopping a flush or a straight draw is much more likely, and that's about 4.5 to 1. Something like 20% of the time you're going to flop a flush or a straight draw, and then we're about 35 to complete that draw by the river. So especially with suited connectors, we have to be very deep to play those hands if we're against a good or a tight player. And with pocket pairs we still have to be fairly deep, but not as deep. We'll talk about in a few slides time exactly how deep we have to be to call with these hands. There's just a couple of concepts that we need to talk about first. So the first one, we're going to talk a little bit about position, where I did another concept video just totally talking about position, and this is going to cover some of the general themes from that. Position is going to affect our applied odds very significantly. Basically, when we're in position, we're going to be able to control whether money goes into the pot on that betting round or not. So for example, if we have a flush draw on the flop and we call and the flush hits on the turn, if we're in position there, we can make sure that a bet goes in. If our opponent's got, say, an overpair, he's not just going to check fold. He's either going to check call once, or he's going to just bet for value, bet for protection, and, you know, bet to sort of see where he's at. If he checks, then we're obviously going to be able to bet, and he's going to at least check call with an overpair, or a good hand in that spot. He's not just going to check fold because the flush hit, because of course, although we have some flush draws in our range when we call a flop c-bet, it's not going to be all flush draws, so it's not just always beat when the flush hits. So basically, when we're in position there, we can make sure that money goes in, and if we bet the turn there and he check calls, then we can bet the river. And sometimes people will just check call down, you know, because they want to see what you've got. They think that you might be bluffing if some straight draws missed, or if they think that you can be value betting the hands other than a flush. So yeah, you definitely, position helps implied odds significantly because you can make sure that money goes in after hitting. When you're out of position, of course, your opponent can either check back or pot control the turn or the river with weak hands. So for example, let's say he bets the flop and the turn completes a flush draw after you check call. You know, when you check to him, he can go back and just check back and see a river, keep the pot small, make sure that he doesn't get check raised, make sure that he doesn't put himself in a tough spot or value cut himself. And therefore, you know, you only have an opportunity to bet the river. So quite obviously, when you're in position, if you hit the turn, you're going to have 2 opportunities to get money in. Whereas when you're out of position, quite frequently, you're going to only have 1 opportunity if he checks back the turn. Or if he bets the turn and you check call, then he might just check back the river anyway. So you can't make sure that you get a lot of implied odds when you're out of position, because it's going to be really hard to do that unless you go for check raise, or unless you lead. But of course, leading is quite difficult because if you're playing against a regular, you're going to have to, you know, try and develop a leading range which is fairly balanced. You know, you can't always just lead with your really strong hands after hitting. You know, you've got to lead with some bluffs there as well. Then that also weakens your checking range, because now you're leading some of your strong hands, so he can barrel more often and get you off of your weak range when you check. So it's very complicated if you start throwing in all these, you know, all these different plays like leading. And obviously with check raising, if you go ahead and check raise after a draw hits, then a lot of the times he's going to be able to find a fold with pretty much all of his all of his hands that aren't ridiculously strong. So positions are a big factor in playing for implied odds, and you definitely want to be much more willing to play with suited connectors or small pairs when you're in position than when you're out of it. And we'll just talk about calling with connectors from the blinds, because quite often I see some weak regulars calling with like 7-8 suited from the small blind versus a middle position open, or hands like like defending 4-5 suited versus a cut-off open, and it's going to be really difficult to do that profitably against any kind of competent player. Because obviously most of the time you're going to flop a very marginal hand and be out of position. If you do flop a made hand, it's very most likely going to be a pair, and usually it's going to be bottom or middle pair, of course, with like small suited connectors, or even with the middle-in connectors, you're very infrequently going to flop top pair or any kind of strong made hand. So very often you're going to be check calling with a weak made hand, or you're going to be check calling with a draw. If you flop a gut shot or an open ender and you check call with like 5-6 on say 7-4-2, at the end of the day you'll check call him with 6 high. It's going to be really hard to show a profit there against a good player, because he's going to barrel a lot of the time and you're going to have to fold, or he's going to check back the turn to pot control and then snap off a river bet when you try and bluff. Also, check raising isn't always good. For example, if you call pre-flop with like 5-6 suited and the flop comes say like queen 10 two-tone, and you go for a check raise, if you check raise with your flush draw there and get re-raised, then you're in a really crappy spot, because you've got a lot of equity but you're going to have to fold. Even when in just general, you're going to be creating big pots with hands like 6 high or 8 high, which is just really bad. And of course, if you just check fold after flopping a draw, then it kind of defeats the purpose of playing the hand anyway, because as we know, very unlikely that you're going to flop a made hand. Most of the time when you call with suited connector, you're going to flop some kind of draw. So in general, I'd stick to free betting or folding those suited connectors, those 7-8s, those 5-6s. They're really, really good hands to throw into your free betting range. And the reason is that, of course, most people put you on high card hands when you free bet, so they create when they do flop a good hand, it's very, very deceptive. Your opponent's not going to put you on it. And of course, you still flop draws the same percentage of the time, which gives you great semi-bluffing potential. If you flop a flush draw or a straight draw and you know that you're 35% to hit by the river, then you don't really need much fold equity when you go ahead and bet like half pot on the flop. And additionally, that because it's a free bet pot, and your opponent, if he's got a hand, he's much more likely to stack off of it and like play pot control or find a fold by the river. If he's got like top pair and you manage to bink your flush on the turn or bink your straight or whatever, then it's much more likely that you're going to get paid off. So your implied odds are much better because because the pot's bigger essentially. So definitely a much better idea to free bet those connectors from the blinds rather than just flat call with them. So let's talk about implied odds to the flop then. Like we said, a flush or an open ender is about 35% to hit by the river, and it's about 18% to hit on the next card. So therefore we need to win about 3 times our investment to justify a flop call. If we're playing 51 and our opponent raises to 3, we call on the button, the big, small blind and big blind fold. Pot's about $7 going to the flop. If our opponent bets 5, the pot's now 12. We're risking 5. We need to win we need to win 3 times our investment, so we need to win like 15, 16 in total when there's already 12 in the pot. So we're always going to have the implied odds to call on the flop. If we don't hit on the turn and he 2 barrels, well, now our odds have gone down significantly and we need to win 5 times our investment to justify calling. It's going to be quite hard to show a profit there. If we call on the flop and the pot's going to be 17 going to the turn, assume that he bets like 12 on the turn. The pot's now 29 and we're putting 12 in. We need to win 5 times 12 total, so we need to win like $60 total. There's about 30 in the pot. We need to win another 30 off our opponent. So basically it's going to have to either bet call the river quite often if we hit, or check call a huge river bet pretty much always. So I think that very often you're not going to have the implied odds to call on the turn if you miss. Therefore, that coupled with another fact that if our opponent barrels a lot, means that raising the flop's usually going to be better with our draws than just calling. The reason is that, like I said, we don't really have the great implied odds with our hand if we miss the turn. If we do raise the flop with our flush draw, we're very rarely getting free bet unless he's got a big hand. Most people are just going to flat call, and some people will just flat call with overpairs there, looking to try and check raise all in on a safe turn. So very often what you can do is you can raise the flop and then check back the turn and see a free river, rather than call the flop bet and have to fold to their turn bet. And if we think about it, if our opponent bets 5 on the flop, if we raise to like 17 there, which is going to be like a fine sizing, if he calls there, we've essentially risked 17 to see the turn and the river. But of course, he's going to fold a lot to our flop raise as well, because most people are c-betting too much. Versus a one and done player, like someone who c-bets a lot and then just gives up on the turn, we can definitely just call with our draws, because so often he's going to check the turn and we can see a free river anyway, so we get to see both cards for the price of the c-bet. But versus aggressive players who barrel a lot, we definitely want to go ahead and raise the flop with our flush draws a lot, and with our straight draws too, just because we take advantage of the immediate fold equity. We stop ourselves having to fold to a 2-barrel, because of course we don't have the implied odds to call again if he does 2-barrel. Thinking about stack odds is really important, and this is particularly applicable to small pairs. Reason is because obviously with small pairs we'll either flop a set or we don't, and when we don't flop a set we can quite easily give up. So let's think about how big their stack needs to be relative to his raise size. The difference between a 3x and a 4x open is pretty big when you have a hand like pocket 2s, 3s, 4s, and you can only win by flopping a set. For 100 big blind stacks, we're going to have 33 to 1 stack odds when he makes it a 3x open, because obviously he's he's opening to 3. We're risking 3x to win. We're risking 3 big blinds to win, like 97. The 97 remaining in the stack. When he opens to 4x, then we're only getting 25 to 1 on our money, because we're risking 4 to win like 96. So therefore, that's quite a big difference. If we think about his range in a single raise pot, people are very infrequently actually going to be able to stack off to you when you do manage to hit. Part of the reason why you have implied odds with small pairs is because of the few times that they have aces, kings, queens, and they stack off on a low board. Most of the time they're just going to c-bet and fold to a raise, or c-bet and check fold the turn. So you need to be pretty deep, and also I think you can only set mine when someone makes it 3x open, 400 big blinds. I think if they make it a 4x open, you pretty much always have to fold unless they're particularly bad. If they're fished, then you can obviously go ahead and call, because sometimes the flop's going to come like 7, 5, 2, and you've got pocket 2s and you raise, and if they're a fish, probably not going to fold even like ace king or ace queen. They're at least going to peel one off and see a turn, just because they think you might be bluffing. They think that ace or their ace outs are good. They think their king or queen outs are good. Or they just think that, they think you might be bluffing and they have the best hand. But against the regular, you're not usually going to have the stack odds to call for a 4x open when they open to that size with 100 big blinds. And talking about suited connectors, we want to be even deeper, because we've got such a low chance of nailing a flop. When pretty much when we have a pair and we flop a set, we've got like the nuts, or the effective nuts anyway. Like, we're obviously going to be going with it and be extremely happy to. And that's going to happen, something like 12% of the time. Whereas with suited connector, we've only got a chance of flopping something that's the effective nuts less than 2%. So we're going to be flopping draws much more often, which means that we need to be quite a bit deeper in order to try and make up that. Versus a tight opening range, we just have way too much equity to make up. We're so very rarely going to actually make a hand. And so therefore, I think versus a competent player who opens under the gun, you want to be at least 150 big blinds deep if he makes it a 3x open, and more like 200 big blinds deep to call a 4x open. Obviously, if our opponent is extremely exploitable, then we can call more often pre-flop. For example, if he's just c-betting like 100% and fold into a raise unless he has top pair or better, then you're going to be able to just call and bluff raise tons of boards. Or if he's firing loads of c-bets and then just giving up on the turn, just playing really weak. Or if he's just playing really weak on the flop, then you can definitely call more often as well. But yeah, these guidelines to call in pre-flop. So call in 3x open if you're 100 big blinds deep, but fold into a 4x open with pairs, and call in a 3x open 150 big blinds deep, and only call in a 4x open if we're 200 big blinds deep with suited connector. These are just guidelines. They come from experience. I've been playing poker for quite a long time, and these come from experience. From playing around in Hold'em Manager, going through filters, I know when I'm showing a profit with my small pairs and suited connectors, and I know when I'm not. And I think that, like I said, from experience and from history, I definitely think that these guidelines are the ones that you want to use when deciding whether to call with hands pre-flop, and then also the same with calling with hands on the flop. So I hope that this video has been useful to you. Leave any comments or questions, I'll try and get back to you. This has been Jack for ipokervip.net. Take care.